Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your July astrological forecast, and just want to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, you notice that there's no lilies. I always have lilies over here, or flowers at least, and I'm heading out of town later today, and I'll be on the East Coast for a month, and I'll be doing my mid-month update for those of you who are Patreon subscribers, and for those of you who are not, you can go to Patreon, patreon.com/Rick Levine. And for $3 a month, you can receive my mid-month update, which is a slightly different orientation, a deeper drill down into the last couple of the weeks of the month. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, because I am on the road, I will not be at Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington for Astrology Night. There will be no live broadcast this month. And so that would normally be on the first Friday night of every month. That would be July 7th. But don't show up at Soul Food Coffee House because I won't be there. And I will be back there on the first Friday of August 4th. And in fact, I'll be there for the remainder of the year on the first Friday nights on September 1st, October 6th, November 3rd, and then December 1st before I leave for India. And I'll be in India for about 6 weeks, which means I will not be at Soul Food on the first Friday of January. That would be January 5th. And while I'm talking about India, I should mention that we still have room available for about 15 more people at the Goa retreat. And you can find out detailed information about the curriculum and the day-by-day activities for the 10-day retreat in the south of Goa, India. And that'll be at an Ayurvedic healing spa right up from the beach, a gorgeous place where I've taught before. It's a very, very magical place. It'll be a 10-day retreat led by me, and it will be entitled Initiation into Astrology, and it will be for beginners or advanced or even professionals. It'll be for anyone involved or interested in astrology. And you can find out more about that by going to Heaven and Earth Workshops. That's all one word, heavenandearthworkshops.com. And I look forward to seeing many of you there. It's going to be an exciting week and a half, and it will fill up. We're over half full already. So if you're interested in that, check it out and get your reservation in. Last thing is that I'll be back at the Omega Institute in mid-October, October 13th, 14th, and 15th. I'll be co-teaching a weekend about Venus and manifestation and all the intricacies of both ritualizing and experiencing and interpreting and working with the planet Venus in the astrology and in your lives. And we'll have more about that in the months ahead. So that's it. I wanted to bring you up to date on those things. And now we're going to jump into the month of July, which is, as we always say, an interesting month. Often when I look at the month ahead, I try to put words around the general overall concept before looking at the individual aspects, the day-by-days, and even the week-by-week energy. July has two major emphases, and those things that are emphasized are the planets Venus and Pluto, for very different reasons. But it's intriguing how the two of them work to create the fabric of the month of July. On the surface, there's not a lot going on in July. We have a few planets that are changing signs. We have the regular cast of characters of the faster moving planets making their regular aspects. Of course, we have a new moon and a full moon. The full moon is on July 3rd. The new moon is on July 17th. We'll drill down on those in just a few minutes. But the intriguing thing is that the nodes which normally move in retrograde motion. The nodes wobble backwards, and the nodes are changing from the axis of Taurus, Scorpio to Aries, Libra. And this is very significant. This occurs technically on July 17th, but there are astrologers use two different ways to track the nodes. Some astrologers use the mean node, which it used to be what was available to us, and that's just the kind of average daily motion of the moon moving backwards, retrograding around in its normal cycle. But with the advent of computers, we track the nodes more carefully, and many astrologers refer to that as the true node rather than the node or the mean node. The difference is that it can make a difference of 2 or 3 degrees, because the moon's nodes actually wobble within their movement, so that every couple of days they're going retrograde direct, retrograde direct, retrograde direct, retrograde direct, and like that. And so the mean node kind of smooths that out, and the true node tracks that absolute motion in real time. Now, the reason why this is intriguing this month is that the nodes actually switch from the Taurus Scorpio axis to the Aries Libra axis. And as they're switching, they're going to make squares to Pluto, which has just switched as it's retrograding back from its temporary visit, its few-month visit into Aquarius, and now back into Capricorn for the rest of the month. In fact, Pluto remains in the last degree of Capricorn all month. So as the moon's nodes switch back into the 29th degree of Aries and Libra, they will form a square with Pluto. Now, the weird thing is that because Pluto is retrograding also, these two movements actually interact with each other exactly 3 times, because the moon's nodes are retrograding. And although the moon doesn't actually turn to direct, the nodes slow down and become stationary, so Pluto actually catches up with them again before they speed up and move back through that same degree. In other words, what we're saying is that Pluto actually makes a square to the north and south nodes of the moon 3 times exactly, on July 22nd, on July 25th, and July 28th, which really means that for all practical purposes, for the last half of July, Pluto is squaring the nodes. And the reason why that becomes even more significant is that in the midst of that, there is an opposition between the Sun and Pluto, as the Sun moves from Cancer into Leo, and it's going to oppose the Sun and square the nodes. And the Sun actually squares the nodes back on the 21st of July. We'll see the charts for all these in just a moment. But the reason why this is so significant is that the 90-degree angle to the north and south node. Remember, if a planet is square the north node, it's also square the south node, because the north and south nodes are always opposite one another. So when a planet is 90 degrees to the nodal axis, it's considered to be at the point of the bending, or the maximum interference between the planet and the nodal axis. In evolutionary astrology, we refer to that point as the skip step, because often the planet at that point is brought into such high focus that it's almost as if we're encouraged to make up for lost time, for overcoming something that in the past we didn't quite manifest while that planet was not quite in the sights the way it is as it's making those squares. And so during this month, the interesting thing is that we have Mercury, when it changes signs from Cancer to Leo, it's going to square the north and south node, and that'll happen in July 11th. Then the sun squares the nodal axis on the 21st, and then Pluto squares the nodal axis on the 22nd, 25th, and 28th, but really it's like so minutely close to that it's really, for all practical purposes, it's already in there. What does this mean? This means that there's a high level of instability and a high level of opportunity to use those planets, Mercury, communication, Sun, our will, our consciousness, and Pluto, the transformational properties that occur when we move out of control realms into the netherlands, into the hell realms, into the death and rebirth part of any cycle. And that's not necessarily meaning physical death. It's the process of letting go of one part of a cycle and moving into another. And so this is all very dramatic stuff. And we're going to see this play out throughout the month. That's the Pluto story. Now, in addition, as I said, there's two things that are highlighted this month. One is Pluto, and it's partly because of the Pluto being in sight of the nodes switching axes, switching signs. And, we're moving from a realm of fixed material, the Taurus Scorpio, where we're dealing with real stuff and resources and wealth and things of value, into a more, what's the right word? Into a realm that has more to do with the concept of relationship. Because when the nodes move back into Aries and Libra, we're really talking about the relationship between self and other, between inside and outside. And it's those points that are going to be exacerbated when Mercury and the Sun and Pluto all make 90-degree angles to those points. Now, meanwhile, during the same period of time, we have the Venus issue. And again, we'll look at the charts here in just a moment, but I want to try to give you the understanding of what this month, what July is really all about, because Venus is already at the beginning of July slowing down. In fact, Venus has already moved into its shadow because Venus turns retrograde on July 22nd at 28.5 degrees of Leo. It's actually 28 degrees and 36 minutes, but we can call that 28.5 degrees of Leo. Now, what will happen with Venus, let me just give you the date, the mechanics here, and then we'll come back and talk about what this means. So Venus turns retrograde at 28.5 degrees of Leo on July 22nd. It backs all the way up to 12 degrees of Leo, 12 degrees and 12 minutes, actually. That's just about 12.25 degrees of Leo. And then on September 3rd, when Venus has retrograded all the way back to 12.25 degrees of Leo, that's when it stations to then turn direct at 12.25 degrees of Leo. What that means is that when Venus originally moved past that 12.25 degree Leo point, which it did back at the beginning of June, on June 5th, Venus moved, Venus entered Leo on June 5th. And then on June 19th, it reached that 12 degrees of Leo, which is the beginning of its shadow period. In other words, Venus enters Leo, and then it reaches 12 on June 5th. It reaches 12.25 degrees of Leo on June 19th. And then it reaches 28 degrees of Leo by July 22nd. It retrogrades all the way back to where it was on June 19th, and turns direct on September 3rd. And that area where it moves through and then back through again, and then once it turns direct on September 3rd, it moves through that area a third and final time, that's called the shadow. And so Venus has been in its shadow since June 19th and won't leave its shadow until October 7th at 28.5 degrees of Leo, and then on October 8th it moves out of Leo and into Virgo. Now, normally Venus whizzes through a sign in about a month, a little bit less than that, but that's close enough to just get an idea. However, now we have Venus that will be in Leo most of June, all of July, all of September, all of August, and the first few days of September. What this means is that if you have planets in Leo, in particular between, let's say, 12 degrees and 28 degrees of Leo, that means that Venus is going to go over those points and back over them again and then over them a third and final time. And in fact, if you have any planets between that 12 and 28 degrees of any fixed sign, that would be Leo and Scorpio and Aquarius and Taurus. That means this Venus retrograde is going to square or oppose or conjoin your planets in your natal chart those same 3 times. And if you have Venus in another fire sign besides Leo, that would be Sagittarius or Aries, then this Venus retrograde is going to trine those planets in your natal chart. Now, the same can be true if you have planets at 12 to 28 degrees of planets that are of signs that are sextile, and that would be in Libra or in Libra or in Gemini, and so the point is that it's really important to know where that 12 to 28 degrees of Leo sits in your natal chart, because Venus is going to be hanging out there for an extraordinarily long period of time, emphasizing that area of your chart with all the things that Venus emphasizes. And those are typically pleasurable things, but we have to remember that too much of a good thing is not necessarily good, and that just because we want or desire Venus something doesn't mean that we'll actually get it. And if we get it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll ultimately be a good thing. But these are all important things to consider, and as we move through the month, we'll drill down on this a bit more. But I want everyone to understand that because Venus is barely moving through the month of July, because it's slowing down on July 1st, Venus is at 21.5 degrees of Leo. And in fact, by the end of the month, or by August 1st, Venus is at 26 degrees of Leo. So Venus is really just crawling along and then beginning to move backward. And as such, it really emphasizes those Venusian things. And that's going to be important wherever Venus falls in your chart. So now let's come back to the beginning of the month and take a quick sweep through the month to try to get a sense of what some of the most important things are. And as we look at a chart for July 1st, the first thing that strikes me is the amount of fiery energy that we have at the opening of the month. We have Venus and Mars both in Leo, and the moon is moving through Sagittarius, so the moon is trining Chiron in Aries, and also trining the Venus and Mars in Leo. And so we begin the month with a bit of a fiery punch. Interestingly enough, though, aside from that, on the beginning of the month, we also have some energy from Mercury moving through Cancer, the Sun also in Cancer, but Mercury and the Sun are both making sextiles with Jupiter, and this is an important kickoff to the month, because even though it falls on a Saturday, it means that there's a lot of opportunity for communicating big ideas, big things. This is exciting because I'm going to be, or will have been by the time most of you watch this, at Omega with 4 other awesome astrologers and nearly 100 people who are interested in this. So it's going to be a lot of fun being able to share this energy that really buzzes. It really is quite extraordinary. The month begins with this highly energized energized energy. Also because the Sun and Mercury, which right now are traveling together, having just had their conjunction at the end of June, they are also making a half square with Mars, which really stimulates the energy even more. By July 2nd, we have Venus making a square with Uranus. This is an important backdrop to the month. We've already had the Mars squaring Uranus the end of June, and that certainly has stirred up a few surprises. But the Venus square Uranus on July 2nd is exciting because it stimulates our needs, our desires. It stimulates what we want. It stimulates our attraction to those things which are outside of the box, maybe even not normally within our realm of what we like. And that doesn't mean we need to grab for everything. It just means that we can be very excited about the possibility of having new experiences. And that's on July 2nd that Venus is squaring Uranus exactly. By July 3rd, we actually have the full moon in Capricorn. And the full moon in Capricorn, opposite, obviously, the sun in Cancer, occurs at 4:38 a.m. All times that I give, of course, as always, are Pacific time, Pacific daylight time at this point in the year. And this chart actually is interesting because of the sun and moon's hard aspect to Mars. In other words, we have Mars at that point of Thor, the point that is square, the point that is half square the sun and square and a half to the moon. And this point of Thor is a point of exacerbation. It stimulates, it energizes, it motivates. And so this is not a calm and easy full moon. And in fact, I think it's even stimulated more by the fact that we also have this square between Venus and Uranus that's still cooking. Now, as much as the square and a half, the sesqui-square to the moon sesqui-square to Mars, and the sun's semi-square to Mars, we also have Jupiter at the point of Thales. So on one side, we have Mars kind of at the point of Thor activating the full moon axis. And on the other side, we have Jupiter that is kind of sedating it, smoothing it, mellowing it out. But it's important to understand that the actual trine from the full moon to Jupiter actually occurs a few hours before the full moon, and the actual sextile of the sun to Jupiter actually occurred back on July 1st, and we already talked about that. Nevertheless, this whole period of time has a great deal of opportunity for learning, for expanding minds, for opening up to potential opportunity, and I'm quite looking forward to this particular full moon. You know, in some ways, the full moon in Capricorn is about trying to make our Cancerian feelings and our sense of belonging and gaining emotional security and safety. It's about balancing that off with creating mastery in the outer world so that we can have that balance between the inner and the outer. As we move on July 5th, we have Mercury moving through a square, Mercury moving through a square to Chiron on July 5th. And that's not a long-lasting aspect, but it certainly can stimulate our need to communicate to, and maybe because we're trying to overcome something, maybe we feel like we missed a chance to communicate with someone in the past. Or maybe even we want to overcome our feeling of being of not communicating well, or even a lack of intelligence for that matter. And in some ways, this stimulates us to reach out and to share our wisdom, but we have to be careful, as with any squares, we don't want to create conflict. We want to use the differences in order to resolve, rather than to create disagreement or conflict. As we move over the next few days, we're hit with a number of sextiles. First, we get Mercury sextiling Uranus on July 6th. And now this again is about communication, but here we're breaking through. We're communicating things that are new and different. And then Mercury moves. I said a couple of sextiles. I meant a couple of positive aspects. First with the Mercury sextile to Uranus. And then by July 9th, we get the Mercury making a trine to Neptune. And that trine to Neptune is exact on the afternoon of July 9th. It's very sweet because we have, during that period of time, we have the power of being able to use our imagination. But this actually is on the edge of something, and I think the July 9th, 10th, and 11th are important days because they're major transitions. And remember, I talked earlier about how planets, that as they move from Cancer into Leo, Mercury and the Sun, will both oppose Pluto and square the nodal axis. Well, here we have Mercury making that trine to Neptune on the 9th. But on the 10th, we have Mercury opposing Pluto as it reaches 29 degrees of Cancer. And we also have Mars at 29 degrees of Leo, making a quincunx with Pluto. So we have some real dynamic energy with Pluto now right at the forefront, with Mercury coming into an opposition to Pluto after it trines Neptune. And this creates a sense of depth and intensity and power and transformation in communication. This again, now we're on Sunday, July 9th, moving to Monday, July 10th, because by the 10th we have Mars having moved into Virgo, now kind of gravitating away from the exact quincunx, the adjustment that it made with Pluto. And now Mercury is exactly opposed Pluto. And later on the 10th, actually, its opposition to Pluto is at about 5 a.m., 4:40 a.m. exactly. But then Mercury moves into Leo later in the day at 9:11 p.m. And so we're getting a real switch of energies here over a couple of days, with both Mars and Mercury contacting Pluto, really bringing up some difficult stuff, bringing stuff out into the open, and us needing to adjust ourselves physically so that we are maybe not making as many waves. Mars moves from Leo into Virgo, where as it's moving through Virgo, we need to control our actions a bit more. We need to make better use of specific actions rather than just being over dramatic and putting all of our intentions out into the open. Now we still have Venus in Leo, and remember, Venus is already slowing down on July 10th as Mars is moving into Virgo. Venus is almost at 26 degrees of Leo, but it never reaches Virgo because it turns retrograde in another about 10 days. And in those 10 days, Venus barely moves a couple of degrees. So that's July 10th. And by the 11th, we have Mercury as it's moving, from Cancer into Leo. By early on the 11th, it makes its exact square with the nodal axis. It reaches the bendings, that point where Mercury becomes the skip step, and we get an opportunity to bring communication into the light in a way that we hadn't before. But here's the thing, that Mercury is still closely opposing Pluto. And so what we bring out into the open here on the 10th and even into the 11th is not easy, especially because on July 10th, the moon moving through Aries is going to be squaring the Mercury Pluto opposition, and as the moon moves from Aries into Taurus, it will actually align with the North Node, and so we have a really dynamic period of time on Monday into Tuesday, the 10th into the 11th. Very, very powerful. Also, by the way, during this period of time, the sun on the 12th is making a square to Chiron, stirring up those old past wounds and hurts, and again, kind of bringing those things up into awareness, where we can either retreat from them or engage them and hopefully solve some past wounds by making things better, by forgiving others. By the 14th, we have an interesting kind of shuffle here, because the sun on the 14th is making that sextile with Uranus that Mercury had made the week before. And this, again, is an opportunity to bring things out into the open, to make breakthroughs. But we also have Mercury making a quincunx with Saturn. And here, what we say might not sit well with authority. We're putting things out into the open now that Mercury is in Leo. We may not be acting physically in the same way that we were, but with Mercury and Venus in Leo, we're actually speaking our piece. We're saying what's on our mind. And yet on the 14th, when Mercury quincunxes Saturn, we may bump up against some resistance. In fact, by the 15th, Venus is making a quincunx with Neptune. And here I should just make a quick aside, because one of the things I noticed about July is there's an extraordinary number of quincunxes throughout the month. And remember, quincunxes are the angle of adjustment. They're the angle that has to do with an irritation that we can't solve the issue, but we can't make it go away. And so it's often a bit of frustration and irritating energy. And I think these quincunxes sit behind us throughout the whole month, but around the 14th and 15th, some of them come to the front. And by the 17th, we have Mercury moving through Leo, and Mercury makes a square to Jupiter. And this can be an overstatement, saying too much, pushing the envelope a little bit too far by what we say. This is exact on the 17th, on that Monday morning. And I think we just need to be aware here that as Mercury is squaring Jupiter, it's also forming a square and a half with Neptune. That's not exact until a little bit later in the day. And so the energy between Jupiter and Neptune, which is a half a square, and Jupiter and Mercury, that is creating this thing where we kind of have an opportunity to be misled. Neptune's involved here. We either can buy what someone else is saying and it's not true, or we might slip and say something that misleads others. There's the opportunity here by over-exaggerating and being misled or misleading others. This is even exacerbated more by the fact that the actual new moon that occurs midday, actually on the 17th, on the same day, the new moon occurs at 11:31 a.m. and this new moon is moving into a trine with Neptune. The sun's trine to Neptune isn't exact until the 20th, but we're already picking up on this energy of imagination. And imagination is wonderful because, as I've said many times before, imagination kind of builds the scaffolding for Saturn to then build reality on. And so this is important as long as we remember to separate imagination from reality. We need to know which is fantasy and which is real. And I think at this new moon, we can be swept up by the imagination of what we create in our own world of self-protection as that new moon in Cancer strives to make our emotional world a safe one, especially because of its trine or its looming trine to Neptune. Remember, the exact new moon itself occurs at almost 25 degrees of Cancer, which means it's about 5 hours away from the moon's exact trine to Neptune, also on that Monday mid-afternoon. So this is a potent period of time. And on top of that, the same day is the day that the nodes of the moon retrograde from 0 Scorpio Taurus to 29 degrees and 59 minutes of Libra and Aries. And so this is an incredibly changeful new moon. There's this whole sense of we may want to go inward to protect ourselves, but it's a trick, because as long as we're dealing with the illusion that we are separate from everyone else, we can come inward to protect. The fact of the matter is that we want to also protect our home, our family, our city, our country, our people, our tribe, and even our home planet. And that's the exercise that we have here as we're doing this dance, especially as Jupiter is also kind of encouraging us to open up and to expand our energy. So the new moon is incredibly potent, and during this period of time, we also, on the 17th and 18th, we have some sesqui-squares. Mercury makes a square and a half to Neptune. Mars makes a square and a half to Chiron on the 17th and 18th. Again, these are stimulating change. They're motivational. The sun's exact trine with Neptune on the 20th. And on the 20th, we also run into a bit of a wall. It's almost like our dreams all of a sudden have the opportunity to precipitate into the three-dimensional world. Why? Because Mars opposes Saturn on the afternoon of July 20th. And this can be a bit abrupt if we pay attention to Saturn. This is an opportunity to make our dreams real. But if we haven't been paying attention to Saturn, then what happens is all of a sudden we're forced to deal with reality in a way that maybe we'd been ignoring before. And this can be rather abrupt, and it can be rather discouraging. It's like Mars, I always think of as the gas pedal. In Virgo, hopefully we've been working it carefully, but all of a sudden, when that Mars runs into the exact opposition to Saturn, it's like someone reaches over and slams on our brake, even if we weren't paying attention, and even if we don't have our seatbelt on, and even if we don't see it coming. So it's really important to keep that Saturn in mind while through the new moon and through the days prior, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, while we're playing in the realms of dreams and imagination and fantasy and all of that, it's important to keep Saturn in mind so that we don't come crashing down to Earth on the 20th, and instead make best use of that period of time of the Saturn's opposition to Mars. And also by the 21st, we have the sun coming up to the end of its stay in Cancer, and late on the 21st, the sun opposes Pluto as it reaches 29 degrees of Cancer, opposing Pluto. And remember now, Pluto is making those squares with the nodes. And so what happens is that the sun opposes Pluto and squares the nodes on the 21st. And right as the sun is changing signs, it moves into Leo the following day on the 22nd. And here we're moving from the inner dimensions to the outer dimensions. We saw this happen when Mercury did it. We saw it when in the days after the new moon, when the moon moved from Cancer into Leo. We're getting it again, and I think this is an incredibly potent period of time. On Friday, the 21st in particular, we have very, very deep power struggles coming out into the open while the sun is opposing Pluto, and things are becoming heated up, especially since the Saturn-Mars opposition. It's like the assertion and the aggression is meeting a bit of reality. This is not an easy period of time at all, even though there is some grace in this period of time, because we do have the moon on Friday moving through a Virgo, meaning that it will also line up with Mars and oppose Saturn, but then it moves into a trine with Jupiter. And as Mars will do the same in the days ahead, I think that this is all very, very important. Meanwhile, we have Venus, which is barely moving. Remember, Venus has slowed down to a snail's pace, or as we say here in Seattle, a slug's pace. The slug is just a naked snail, a snail without a shell. But Venus is stationary and turns retrograde on the 22nd. And that Venus is in a very interesting position because it's still holding up that quincunx to Neptune, meaning that we may not be clear about what we really want. Our desires and even the money situation in our lives may be a bit unclear, especially with Venus turning retrograde and coming back into that quincunx with Neptune in the days ahead. So we have that Venus station on the 22nd. And we also have on the 22nd the first exact square between Pluto and the true nodes, which are now back at 29 degrees of Aries and Libra. Chiron has also been slowing down, and Chiron on the 23rd is stationary retrograde. And so this is just another piece in this whole, puzzle that's unfolding. We have, as Chiron is stationed, we have Venus and Mercury both kind of in Leo, either coming out of making a trine with Chiron. Both Mercury and Venus have recently, but Venus now turning retrograde will retrograde back through that trine to Chiron, even though that doesn't occur until August, until next month. But that's important because the whole opportunity for healing is still it looms large, and that's a lot of what's going on. There's a lot of imbalance this month, but there's a lot of potential for getting things right. Mercury makes an exact square with Uranus. And remember, we had that Mars square Uranus and Venus square Uranus. The Mars squared Uranus back at the end of June. Venus squared Uranus back toward the beginning of the month. And now we have Mercury squaring Uranus, and this is exact on Sunday the 23rd. Exciting communication, breakthrough, maybe not graceful, but things are said. We also have Pluto still squaring the nodes. This is the second of the three exact squares it makes to the true node. And we have Mercury also making a quincunx to Neptune. What we're saying is not clear. It's not exact. It's wobbly. People are not hearing what's being said. We're missing the main point. And on top of that, as we move on, and by the way, that moves us on to the 25th, 26th. The 25th is when Pluto is exactly square the nodal axis again. The 26th is when Mercury makes that quincunx with Neptune. And then by the 27th, Mercury catches up with stationary retrograde Venus. Here we can speak our piece, and yet we also have this whole quincunx between that Mercury, Venus, and Neptune still in play, which means that we're working in the realms of uncertainty, and as long as we recognize that, we're okay. But things are not as stable or not as stabilized as we would like to have them. We then have, by the 28th, Pluto making its third exact square with the nodal axis. And on the 28th, Mercury also leaves Leo, and it does that mid-afternoon. So if we look at the chart here for midday at noon, Mercury is still in Leo, but by 2:30 in the afternoon, it moves into Virgo, where it's in its second home sign. Mercury is at home in Gemini and Virgo, and we'll feel that energy over the days ahead, and more particularly into the month of August, when our communication will become more exacting and hopefully clear up from its muddled state that it's in right now, with that quincunx still holding to Neptune. On the 28th, we have the Sun making its quincunx. Remember, I said there were a lot of quincunxes here, and it's true. On the 28th, we have the Sun making a quincunx with Saturn, and now again we have this uncertainty between what's being shown to us, the Sun in Leo, and Saturn, the truth that we think that lurks out there, but it may be difficult to find because Saturn retrograding in Pisces is a little complicated. Also, by the way, on Friday the 28th, we have the moon moving through Sagittarius, so it will make a square earlier in the day to Saturn and trine the Sun. So we're getting that kind of quincunx energy magnified. Remember, as the Sun quincunxes Saturn, the moon making a square and a trine kind of exacerbates the quincunx, where everything's perfect and everything's messed up all exactly at the same time. And we end the month kind of on a quiet note and a bit of I don't want to say dissatisfaction, but it's not fully comfortable because of the Sun's quincunx to Saturn, and then Venus's quincunx to Neptune. Remember, we talked about that earlier because Venus made that quincunx to Neptune, and then I said it would, and then so did Mercury, and I said Venus would come back into that quincunx, and that's exact on July 30th. So that's it. It's a bit of a rock and roll month, although there's not the regular outer planet transit aspects that we see, but between the Venus story and the Pluto story, I think we're in for some deep changes, and I think it's really important for us to keep our eye out not only on what's going on day by day and week by week, but keep our eye on the longer trajectory, because it's the Venus retrograde which is saying that what's going on right now is not done. Those things which happen that are in relationship, that have to do with our values, that have to do with things that are Venusian, that are things of value to us, whether they're money or possessions or ideas, that as Venus through late June and July and August and even September, it's going to kind of go through that same area of the sky again and again and again for the third and final time, not until September into early October. And so it's important to realize that we're playing on a trajectory that has not completed, even though it might feel like some of the events are end events, like, okay, deal done. And the other thing, of course, is the nodes and the Pluto thing. And both of those are longer trajectories. And so even though there's a lot of shifting going on, I just want to caution everybody from jumping to any conclusions and thinking that whatever it is you think is going on is done and finished and over now. Things will continue to unfold. I'll see many of you, those of you who are on the Patreon at the solar level. I'll see you guys mid-month, and for everyone else, have a safe month. I'll be back in Seattle, back in my home office, actually in Redmond, and I'll be back at Soul Food Coffee House on the first Friday of August. I think that's on the 5th. I had that day written down here somewhere. August 4th, actually. And until then, think cosmically, act locally, because it doesn't do any good to think cosmically unless you act locally. That's it for now. Rick Levine, out. Peace to all.